But the thing I want to talk about most is this idea of engagement or student participation. The more I think about this and the more I visit schools and watch lessons, the more I realize it's the key to everything, in the sense that if you don't get this bit right, everything else is a bit of a waste of time. It doesn't matter how good your explanations are, how good your tasks are, how good your checks for understanding are. If the kids aren't listening, paying attention, engaged, you are literally wasting your time. So that's what I want to kind of frame everything around, and we'll be, as I say, shooting off on tangents left, right and centre. But to start, I want to quote something from one of your blog posts, and I'll link to all of these in the show notes. And this is, you say, our job as teachers is to ensure that 100% of students are engaged 100% of the time. And that's quite a bold statement. So the first thing I want to dig into, and you've alluded to this a little bit already, what do you mean or not mean by being engaged? And why is 100% the target to aim for?
Yeah, so if we think about what do we want our students doing in the classroom, I think everybody would agree. Well, I think, I'm pretty sure everybody would agree that it's that they're learning something. Um, and in order for students to learn, the students have to be attending to whatever the information is that we want them to learn. So their attention has to be kind of fully engaged with the material, the content that you want them to be learning. So what I mean by 100% engagement isn't what I described in my first lesson, where imagine the students are all on the hunt, they're looking around, they're playing with the trays of water and picking out carbon dioxide. They might, you could argue that they're engaged in doing something, but are their brains thinking about photosynthesis? So I think the starting point of this is, does the teacher have 100% clarity about what it is that they want the students to be thinking about during the lesson? So once that teacher has that clarity, you're then kind of when you're planning, when you're delivering the lesson, you're thinking, are my students every second of this lesson thinking about what is it that that objective is? What is that the learning goal there? And it's important that it's 100%, because if it's not 100%, then for a particular student who's not paying 100% attention, they're missing out on every second they're not paying attention, they're not learning, and that's a precious opportunity lost. Now, all my life I've worked in schools where the cohorts, the intake is relatively disadvantaged. And so it's even more urgent for them, because a lot of them, their reading ages are far behind what they ought to be, or their knowledge of science is their baseline knowledge of science is much lower than I would expect an 11-year-old to have. So we're playing catch up with a lot of these students. But actually, I hear that argument a lot, and I'm relaying it back to you now. But even if I taught the most advantaged cohort ever, I would still want 100% attention, because in my eyes, uh, every minute that you're in school, that you're having a lesson, almost feel like I'm duty bound to make sure that you are getting the most out of that lesson. My job is to teach you science, and so I want to make sure that every minute, every second of that lesson, you are learning science. Um, and I want to push every one of my students as much as I can to be thinking as hard as they can, and to be making as much progress as they can within the lesson, with their understanding, developing their knowledge of the science that I want them to learn. And so, and that's just important in and of itself, like regardless of any kind of end goal. Are you learning as much as you possibly can in my lesson? So it's important that every child is attentive 100% of the time, because I want them to be learning as much as possible throughout the lesson.
It's interesting, isn't it? So, what I want to know, if I was to walk into your classroom and you were confident you'd got 100% of your students engaged and paying attention, I'm interested what that would look like to me as an observer, as a visitor to your room. And the reason I ask is, one of the things that really kind of transformed my practice when I had my kind of midlife crisis or mid-career crisis was Rob Coe's Poor Proxies for Learning. And when I went through all those, I thought, well, that's exactly what I do. That's exactly what my room looks like. So if someone was to visit my room 7, 8 years ago or whatever, it would be amazing if the kids are out of their seats, one kid's at the board trying to do some teaching, kids are in groups, talking, moving around and so on and so forth. What would it look like for you? What if I was to walk in and you got your kids 100% engaged? What would I see, Pritesh?
So it depends what was going on in the lesson. There are normally a maximum excluding kind of science practicals, so let's put that to one side, but in a typical lesson, there's only 3 or 4 things that my students will be doing. They're either listening to what I'm saying and watching what I'm pointing at, what I'm writing on under the visualizer. So attention on the teacher, so that's one thing. Second thing, they might be doing some independent work, so they'll be doing some writing. Third thing is they are talking to the person next to them during a turn and talk. That's the only time they're allowed to talk to the person next to them. They never talk during independent work. Um, and then kind of in between all of those, and I know we're going to talk about this later, they might have their hands up because they're waiting to give an answer. But I think I've literally covered everything that could be happening in my classroom. Like there's not any more variety than that. Occasionally they might be writing on mini whiteboards. And I think that's about it. So when you walk into the classroom, this is what you would see. If I was instructing, I would expect all students to have nothing in their hands. So their hands are empty, just so they're not. There's lots of reasons for that. So number one is uh, it shows me that they're listening to what I'm saying rather than writing something else. Because I mean, it is literally impossible to write what you've got in your head that you're then transcribing and listen to new content at the same time. I know that when I was sat in lectures and or in talks and things, I'm writing something down. I can't simultaneously listen to something new. And so that's to support them to make sure they're listening to what I'm saying, that no one should have anything in their hands. They're certainly not fidgeting. They are looking in my direction. If I'm pointing at something on the board, I want them to be able to see what I'm pointing at, because I might be saying, this is called the petal, this is called the stamen, this is called the whatever. And if they're not watching, then they're not really learning at that point. So you'd see attention on the students. If I didn't have 100% attention and you were stood at the front next to me of my classroom while I was teaching, you might see a kid staring out the window, and I would see that as a failure on my part to make sure that they were with me in that lesson. Or you might see a student that's kind of, getting something out of their bag or rummaging or fidgeting, anything which shows that they're not paying attention, uh, are those proxies. Um, I think, I mean, critics would say things like some students need to fidget, some students, I can pay attention fine if I'm not looking towards the speaker, and I hear that a lot. Um, and I think the only thing I would say back to that is I can't afford to have my students perhaps paying attention. I need to make sure that everyone is paying attention. I also think it's really helpful. It's so much easier as a teacher if everyone is looking your way. The one student doesn't look your way, you can notice that that they might not be paying. They might be paying attention and looking the other way, or they might not be paying attention. Why not just have them all paying attention? That way I know, and that way if I have 30 pairs of eyes on me, it just makes it so much easier because you know the class is with you as you're speaking, and as soon as someone does something different, you can bring them back, and they know you're there to support them with that learning because we've built up that relationship, we've explained that rationale to them. Um, and so, whilst some of those might seem like proxies for attention, I think that is your baseline, right? Now, of course, the problem we have when behavior in a school is really strong, you can get all the kids sat up straight, tracking you, and they're still daydreaming. Like, of course, that's going to happen. So, just because they're looking at me, does that mean that they're all definitely listening? Absolutely not. And that's where, and we'll come to this later, the checks for listening and the kind of the question, high frequency questioning comes into play. That's where hands up becomes really important. Um, so I guess the other thing you would expect to see is when I then ask simple questions, the way you know that there's high engagement and that the students are actually listening is all without fail, 100% of hands go up. And every time I pick students to answer those checks for listening questions, they succeed in answering those questions. And that's my I suppose my test for whether or not they're actually listening, whether they're actually paying attention or not.
It's great, this, Pritesh. Horrible question here. Is 100% really achievable? And the reason I ask this is that there's always exceptions, right? That you always think, well, what about that kid? What about that kid? And there tends to always be one or two in every class. Are you saying hand on heart that you can get 100% in all classes, most classes? How does that play out?
It's a good question, and I think, if we're going to talk really honestly about this, I think it's an important one to answer. I think the goal should be 100%, absolutely. I think this is why a culture of hands up is so important, and why I despise hands down cold calling so much, because culture is so powerful. Everyone wants to belong. Every student in a class doesn't want to stand out for the wrong reasons. And if you, as a teacher, are able to cultivate a culture where the norm is putting your hand up, then, you know, 90% of students will follow that without much hesitation, in my experience, especially if it's a school-wide culture thing. But even if it's not, it's possible to get about 80, 90% of your class there, putting their hands up. It's the final 10, 20%, depending on the class, which is trickier. And what you find is the more you have a culture of hands up, the more the rest are kind of pulled in towards that, pulled to that decision of I might as well put my hand up now. And where you have a few students that don't participate, you then you then know for sure. When you have a culture of hands up, you've revealed it's like a magic spell. You've revealed who's not participating in your lessons. Whereas if you don't have kind of people putting their hands up and you're just cold calling without hands up, then you don't know who's not participating. You have no idea. You've lost that really precious, valuable data. And then you can investigate and you can speak to those students and find out why. And that might be depending on the context. It might be within the lesson. You might just push for 100% hands up. You might, you might speak to them in the playground. You might speak to their tutor and find out why is their hands not going up. Is it because a lot of the time it's because, oh, I just couldn't be bothered to put my hand up. And then you say, well, no, that's not the expectation in my classroom. You've got to put your hand up. I'm going to make sure and I'm going to hold you to account because I care too much to let you fail in my classroom. If you're not putting your hand up, it shows me that you're probably not listening or that you don't want to contribute. But I want you to contribute in my classroom because it's really important that I hear your voice in my lesson. And when you narrate it to that to loads of students, again, you've won those students over. They needed that extra nudge, and then you're left with your really reluctant kind of students who just don't want to put their hands up. And again, you have a conversation with them. What's going on? Why aren't you putting your hand up? Like, I would love to see your hand up in the lesson. What's stopping you? And when you have those honest, heartfelt conversations with them, and you show them that you just want them to succeed, and you love seeing the hand up, you'd love to hear from them. Uh, I think most students are winnable, and I've not had till date students who've just not never put their hand up. And if that was genuinely the case, that someone still wasn't putting their hand up, then I would want the tutor, the head of year, the family to be involved because that you can't there can't be students who just choose not to participate in the lesson, and to not address that because if there's some sort of underlying cause, then that's something that you want the students to overcome whatever the reason is that's stopping them from participating. If it's a fear of failure, then it's our duty as teachers to help them overcome that fear of failure. If it's something about being very self-conscious, then again, that's something you want to help them on that journey of becoming more confident. Um, and so I think that's really all of that ties together. But I think another important point there is the point on behavior and kind of culture of error and safety as well. If you have a culture where a student gets an answer wrong and then students laugh and then there's no consequence for those students laughing, then again that seems like quite a reasonable reason why a student might not want to share and contribute an answer. And so again, then that becomes really important for you as a teacher to reflect and think, what's the culture like in my classroom? And for leaders in the school to think, what's the culture like in the school? If students can laugh at each other for getting something wrong, then that's a cultural issue that needs fixing. And so I think you're right to point those exceptions out because it speaks to a wider culture that has to be there in the first place, or has to be something that we aspire to cultivate, a culture of error, a culture of making mistakes being fine, being okay. Um, but I think that's the reason why the 100% engagement goal is so powerful because it then forces you to confront all of these issues because if you have kids who are reluctant to put their hands up, and that's because of an issue of culture in your classroom or in your school, then suddenly you're confronted with that reality, and you're not able to meet that goal of 100% hands up. Then you have to do something about the culture of error. You have to do something about helping those students who might be a bit nervous about putting their hands up and investigate what the reason is and help them on that journey. So I think for that reason, that kind of beyond what I've put in my blog post, it's such a powerful strategy for all of those reasons.
That's great. That's fantastic, Pritesh. Now, I'm loving this. You're teasing people with this all hands up. You're keeping them hooked in. This is great. We're going to keep them waiting. Just one more question. So I just want to dive a bit deeper into behaviour. So I'll tell you a quick story here. I talked with Ollie Lovell about this on our kind of monthly collaboration podcast thing we're doing. So I was in two schools recently doing some support for the maths department. And on the face of it, behaviour in both schools looked very similar and was excellent in the sense that when I was stood outside a classroom waiting to go in, I didn't even know whether there were kids in the class because they were so quiet, so, well, as I say, on the face of it, so focused and so on. But they were very different, and the outcomes for the kids, as things currently stand, were very different. One school, when the teacher did ask a question, very little response at all from kids. It was like you're getting blood out of a stone. Like, they ask a question, nobody would volunteer. You'd cold call. Kid would be like, I don't know, or just opt out and so on. Other school, same kind of level of behaviour in terms of when the kids were supposed to be quiet, they were silent. But then when the teacher asked the question, kids were volunteering, or when they cold called, kids had answers ready. They were ready to turn and talk to the partner and so on. So it's really made me think a bit deeper about behaviour, that there's a lot more going on kind of below the surface than what may seem. So this long ramble is just to say, what for you is the kind of relationship between engagement and behaviour? Do you need to say the kids are behaving well? Do you need them to obviously be listening to you and kind of following rules, but also be actively involved in the lesson? Do the two kind of go hand in hand? Does high engagement lead to better behaviour, if that makes sense?
Yeah, 100%. All of these things are, it's a virtuous cycle. The more things you have in place, the better all the things that come before that fall into, like, kind of build up as well. So what I mean by that is this. Kind of have in my head like a model of kind of teaching and learning. And that model is uh, kind of the most basic thing you need in your classroom is you need uh, the attention of the students. And so what that means is you need everybody following instructions when you give those instructions. If you ask for silence, you get silence. Um, if you ask for students to be working independently, everyone's picking up their pen and working independently. So you have kind of the attention of the students, they're following those instructions. And I think that schools that have achieved that is already incredible because I know that in many schools, the behavior isn't anywhere near that. And I think that that's a very incredible and important milestone to reach as a school, and it requires a whole school concerted effort to achieve. If you have achieved that as a school, I think the next focus should be participation and making sure that you have high levels of participation. Because kind of what I described first, you could argue is essentially compliance, where the kids are just doing what they're told, but they're not really necessarily thinking, they're not working hard, there's not a culture of learning, and all the rich things that you want in the school. But that behavior, the listening to instructions is kind of necessary but not sufficient for what I would call 100% engagement. Um, so then the next stage up would be participation, getting everyone involved, and that's I know we're going to be talking about that next. And then once you have everyone getting everyone involved, the next stage kind of comes more to the teacher of like how clear is their explanation, how good is their questioning, how skillful are they at thinking about how well the students how well they're breaking down the content for the students to access and succeed. Because again, you could have um, really good behavior and they might be paying attention, but if the teacher's explanations aren't clear enough and the students won't be making progress sufficiently or quickly enough. And then kind of, I think the final stage, once you've got really good explanations and questioning, would be kind of the responsive element of teaching. So how good are the teachers at reading what the misconceptions are? Are the students actually really understanding, or have I just asked lots of simple questions and I've fooled myself into thinking my students understand when they haven't really? Or the students will get lots of things wrong and the teacher doesn't quite realize or doesn't react in the way that then closes the loop between the feedback and the wrong answers that they got and the re-explanation, and they ensure that their students have got it before they move on, or they completely change their lesson plan. So I think in my head, that's kind of the order of things that a school can focus on in order to really push the teaching and learning forward. So you've got to secure attention first, behavior first, Then you're thinking about participation, and then it does all those things that we've talked about, kind of revealing. It's very the participation bit kind of reveals any other issues you have in your classroom, explanations and questioning, and then finally kind of the responsive element. So I think that, yeah, what you saw, uh, I would say the first school was at the first stage where they've got silence, but they don't have anything else. And then the second school was somewhere along the other stages, depending on what the lessons were like and the quality of the explanations were like.
Well, the mistake you're making here, Pretish, you're saying too many good things here, so we're doing another little tangent here. I think you're right. I think what was quite nice about this first school is I could say that. I said, look, you've got a really solid foundation here. So if we start then getting the kids to participate, whether it's mini whiteboards or whatever it may be, it's going to be much easier for you to transition to that stage than if you've got a school where behaviour is kind of off the wall and stuff like that. But let's imagine you've got a school where behaviour is a bit ropey, to say the least. You've got kids who are not used to listening all the time. It's fairly normal for them when a teacher's giving an explanation to be talking to the person next to them and so on. And again, this is, I don't want to say it's the norm, but it's certainly very prevalent in many of the schools I visit. Is there, do they have to kind of go back to basics and get that behavior and almost get compliance? Or do you think there's, if instead of focusing on the compliance, if they jump straight to the participation and they start to have this culture where the kids are going to be asked to all respond at the same time, whether it's mini whiteboards, call and response, cold calling in whichever way it is, do you think if you kind of almost sidestep the attention, focus straight in on the participation, you may kind of drag the attention along with it? Or do you think you have to say, no, all right, let's focus on compliance first and build up step by step, if that makes sense?
It's a good question. I think as I said before, I think they do reinforce each other.
Yeah.
Um, I think that you want, like, those participation strategies, encouraging participation will help with behavior. So I'll give you a good example of that. In my first school, I was at my Teach First placement school for 3 years. In my second year, I had this class. They were a year 9 class, and they were very challenging, to say the least. It was a set 2 of 5. Very, very challenging class. Like, just getting them in the room and sat down in their seats and like listening felt like the most difficult task. Um, and kind of over time, I think I got them in a place where I was happy with them. And then in year 10, I started to explore the idea of direct instruction. And I read lots of blogs. I mean, Daisy Christodoulou's book, Seven Myths, changed my life. Um, and I started to basically what I did was I used to write almost like my own textbook. So I'd write some text and some comprehension questions, text comprehension questions on the lesson that I was teaching. So I'd hand out the sheet at the start, and there'll be a little do now with some retrieval questions at the start, text to read, and then questions to answer. And I honestly found that just by switching from having a PowerPoint and from having kind of, oh, guess what's going on here, kind of posters around the room, lessons, to that style where they all could literally, I could say, right, we're all going to use our rulers to read. I want you all looking at the line number 1, right? Let's all read now. Even that, with a really challenging class, actually helped with the behavior a lot. And I was really surprised. I thought, oh my goodness, they're all doing what I'm telling them to do. And because it was quite successful, we then rolled it out across the department. So I was at that point, my role was I was head of biology, and my schemes of work all literally used to be posters around the room. I remember it sat in one department meeting where one teacher kind of said, "Oh, Pritesh, all your work, every lesson I see of yours just posters on the room," as a bit of a joke, and I laughed and I said, "Yeah, because that's the best way to do it." Um, and everyone kind of said, yeah, 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 and nodded along. And I thought, and then literally a year later, I was like, posters on the room, nonsense. I can't believe it. We're launching booklets now. And so with one of our biology schemes of work, I made a booklet in advance of all those lessons with questions and things. And we launched it as a department. And I went into one of the trainee teachers' rooms because I was observing, giving a bit of feedback. And I was blown away at the transformation that just having a booklet had, because I was sat at the back of the room next to one of the literally one of the naughtiest girls in the school, and she had her hand up because she wanted to answer a question that the teacher had asked, but at the same time, she was writing and filling in the questions that she wasn't supposed to yet do in the booklet. And the reason was because she was able to find the answer in the text earlier above, and the teacher's giving the explanation. So she was able to suddenly access the lesson. Whereas when you're delivering from a PowerPoint, when you're kind of just teaching one thing at a time and then asking one question at a time, and the information's gone from the slide, and you're thinking, oh, what did the teacher say? And you can't participate, then a student like that might be tempted to misbehave because they're not following the lesson. What's the point? So I'm just gonna, I don't care about this lesson kind of attitude. But suddenly having the booklet, I could just see that that had transformed her relationship with that lesson, with the subject. She was literally trying to answer two questions at once. Um, and that for me was a moment where I kind of really understood the power of um, the how important it is to set the students up to succeed. And what are you doing as a teacher to help your students to pay attention, to behave better? And there's 100 factors there. There's literally 100. I know we're going to talk about a lot of this later on. Um, but everything feeds. It's not just. I know I described it as stages earlier on, but everything feeds into each other. And the more of the things you have in place, the easier you'll find it to push the success rate of those students doing what we want, which is 100% attention in 100% of lessons, 100% of the time. So I think absolutely, yes, go for push lots of strategies where you can, and do them simultaneously, but as much as the staff and the school can handle. Because if you say to staff we're doing 50 strategies at the same time, obviously that's not going to work as well. But you want to be able to introduce kind of changes in a school in stages, in which case I would say you need to start off by having a really clear system of sanction and praise, and so you can reinforce the behaviors that you want to see and not want to see. So I think because of that idea of, for teachers then implementing these changes to be able to do kind of all these things at the same time is tricky, which is why I think thinking about it in stages is helpful, but that doesn't mean that the other things won't help as well, if that makes sense.
Got it.